For richer, for poor, divorce, its economic patterns, and its consequences for future generations. Divorce and future generations. The family is an important economic unit. This unit is comprised of many different people from many different backgrounds. However, there's usually two major sources of income from the parents. A rip or separation in this unit can cause discourse for both present and future generations, both socially and economically. Over the years, divorce rates have changed, and they have spiked and decreased at interesting points in history. For example, during World War I, the rate of marriages declined while the rate of divorce increased. This is understandable, as during a time of war, many marriages might rush to the altar only to find out that they aren't meant for each other. During times like the Great Depression, rates in marriage and divorce dropped. Getting married became a luxury and too expensive, and divorcing seemed nonsensical because it was more valuable to have that strong unit with two major income sources rather than to separate over other reasons. World War II showed that both marriage and divorce increased proportionally because, as with World War I, many people rushed to the altar either before or after the war to celebrate or to keep in touch while their husbands were overseas. The divorce rates now have steadily decreased. Marriage has become less important over the years. This is due to social customs, mainly from the 60s and 70s, such as more power and rights given to women, as well as marriage becoming less about duty and obligation and more about the love and intimacy shared between the two partners. Divorce has also come with less penalties. Reagan signed the No-Fault Divorce Bill, which basically prevented fabrications that ended marriages. Back in Reagan's time, you had to have a specific reason, whether it was abuse or adultery, in order to get a divorce. However, with this No-Fault Bill, it allowed marriages to end with little to no reason at all. As you can see with this graph from the Wall Street Journal, the trends in marriage and divorce are very clearly displayed here. You can see that there is a general parallel between that of trends of marriage and divorce. However, if you draw your attention to the very tail end of the graph, you can see that marriage kind of mellows out towards the end of the graph. However, in recent years, divorce has had a tiny increase. So who gets divorced? According to the U.S. Department of Labor, men and women are very close. Men get divorced 42% of the time, while women get divorced 47% of the time. In ethnicity, we see a similar story. Hispanics, 45.5% of the time, African Americans, 48% of the time, and whites, 43% of the time. However, when we look at education, the story becomes a little more clear. High school dropouts get divorced 58.2% of the time, as opposed to those with a bachelor's degree or higher, which only get divorced 30% of the time. High school grads and people with college educations get divorced around the same. So what does this mean? Well, it shows that natural traits such as sex or ethnicity don't necessarily have an input in whether or not you are more likely to get divorced. Education plays a major role, as we saw in the last slide. The higher your education, the higher your chance of staying together. So why is education such a major factor when it comes to whether or not a marriage will work or not? Well, education determines your income. Income determines your social mobility. Social mobility determines your social class, and the higher your class, the higher your comfort. So in this case, you can afford to live by yourself a while you search around for that special someone. Lower classes don't have that luxury, and they're more likely to get married earlier to once again create that family unit with two major incomes. Higher classes also have more access to ways to help marriage, such as marriage counselors, ways to lower your stress, as well as the luxury of nice living conditions. So if you have to get divorced, what are the damages? Well, as you can see by the chart in front of you, the overall income after divorce has stayed relatively the same over the years. In the early 2000s, you can see that there is a much harder hit to finances in the first couple of months after a divorce. However, there is a steady increase as time goes on. A very big difference to that of the 1980s, which starts off strong, but then slowly dwindles over that same period. Child support, however, gives a much bigger increase in finances than it did in the 1980s. As you can see by the dotted line, child support skyrockets right after divorce is declared, as opposed once again to the 1980s, where child support increases but then slowly dwindles, much less than it does now. However, cohabiting families, or rather families that simply live together and aren't officially married, stays relatively the same. There's more sympathy from the government for married couples than there is for those that are not married. This flips, however, when you look at network income. As you can see in the beginning of the graph, married couples are more likely to have friends and family give money rather than cohabiting families. However, after divorce, you can see a very steady income from cohabiting families as they're more likely to share living residences with non-romantic partners, whereas married couples start off strong but slowly dwindle as they're expected to live on their own. So we've talked about the increases and decreases of divorce, the economic ramifications, the costs, the consequences, and who's most likely to get divorced. So what does all of this have to do with future generations? Well, to simply put it, divorce affects the children of the families involved, socially, education-wise, and in the long run, economically. Observe this chart that measures the problem behaviors of children by parents' marital status. As you can see here, children of divorced families have a much higher tendency to have problems in their behavior, especially when it comes to lying, than those with intact marriages and structured families. When looking at the GPA of divorced children against those of intact families, you can once again see a correlation between those with a structured family and those who have been separated. As you can also see, those who have remarried, the ones labeled by STEP, have a similar GPA to that of divorced parents. Same thing with cohabit parents and those who have never married. Once again, when we look at this chart of unwed pregnancies, you can see a strong correlation between children who have divorced parents and children who have married parents. There is once again a strong correlation. As you can see, those with married parents have a very good handle on their lives, whereas parents who have remarried, never married, or have been divorced have a significantly higher rate. So in conclusion, it's a vicious cycle. Divorce affects families and future generations of that family. It affects the education of the child that it's based in, and that affects their income, their social class, their way of living, and whether or not they are more likely to get divorced in the future. The moral of the story is, if you want a better life for your child, stay together as a family. And here we have my works cited.